Good morning. This is Mike Switzer with the South Carolina Business Review. More than 30 years ago, most corporate assets were buildings, machinery, or other hard assets. Today, the majority of company assets are actually intangible. Although many of today's business leaders came of age after this striking reversal in asset makeup, many Internet-era decision-makers don't proactively plan for their employees' inventions or know how to keep their company processes out of the hands of competitors or, in fact, know how to use their company's trademarks. Our next guest says these companies are missing golden opportunities to capitalize on their intellectual property rights. Bernie Klosowski is an intellectual property attorney with Turner, Padgett, Graham, and Laney, and he joins us now from his office in Greenville, South Carolina. Bernie, good morning.
Good morning, Mike.
Now, first of all, for our listeners, give us a basic description or definition of intellectual property.
Well, the key word is property. I think most folks have heard of patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets. Those are all forms of intellectual property. I like to use the analogy of real property, and you can do with intellectual property many of the same things you can do with real property, such as licensing, renting, selling, or buying.
And now, how can a business owner identify this intellectual property within his company if it's not obvious at first?
It doesn't have to be complicated. It is something you can do through a simple audit, and those can be done when you're doing other types of normal business practices, when you're setting a budget.
Does that basically mean you have to be a fairly good-sized company to have your intellectual properties buried somewhere?
No. As a matter of fact, if you are a single-person company, you probably have some form of intellectual property, whether you know it or not. Even your trademark is a form of intellectual property. In other words, the name of your business and how you inform the public about your business through some form of mark, a symbol, a design, a word. You have intellectual property in that respect.
Okay, and so what are these potential financial benefits, these golden opportunities that I mentioned in the introduction that intellectual property can have to a company that they may not be aware of?
Well, I like to think of intellectual property as a sword and a shield that you can use to protect yourself against a competitor, either by shielding yourself from a competitor infringing on your property or using it as a sword against them to essentially make them play fairly in the marketplace. Delving into that a little deeper, you can even take a patent, for instance, to the bank and literally get a loan on it, just like you would with any other collateral. So in these economic uncertain times, you might be able to use your intellectual property to bridge a gap, financially speaking.
Now, are there any potential consequences for companies that don't protect their IP other than the obvious that maybe patent infringement?
The problem that many companies face when they, especially in uncertain economic times, when they're more interested in just trying to make payroll and they're neglecting their intellectual property, it's not so much that they aren't making money on it themselves, but you may have a competitor out there that is turning your own intellectual property against you. For instance, if you turn a blind eye toward what your competitors are doing and they're innovating in your area and you don't know what they're doing, you may find yourself infringing their intellectual property. The flip side of that is that you may have a situation that I have right now with a current client where they ignored their own trademark, and ironically, a competitor took their trademark and is using that against them, and they're now having to defend themselves in federal court based on their own trademark, ironically speaking.
I bet you don't see that very often, where a company logo has been all of a sudden usurped by another company?
It happens more than you might imagine, and a lot of the reason for that is because many people aren't paying attention to it.
How do you pay attention to that? How do you, I guess you just surf the Internet continuously looking for competition?
Well, I think it goes back to just doing an audit, and again, it doesn't have to be formal. You can just take a look at what people in your field are doing. If you're a coffee shop, for instance, it might not be a bad idea to keep an eye on the competitors in your area, and maybe, like you suggest, a simple search of the Internet But those simple searches, the only hazard there is that if you're not doing it efficiently, you're probably missing things that you might be able to pick up with a more formal audit.
Well, Bernie, is there a website our listeners can go to learn more about this topic?
Well, you could go to my website at turnerpadgett.com, and under practice areas, click on intellectual property law. And I would also encourage listeners to go to the U.S. government website. That's uspto.gov.
All right, Bernie, thanks a lot for your time this morning.
Thank you, Mike.
Bernie Klosowski is an intellectual property attorney with Turner, Padgett, Graham, and Laney, and he spoke to us from his office in Greenville, South Carolina. With the South Carolina Business Review, this is Mike Switzer.